have a watch on?
I do, Josh.
Does it say the same thing that my watch does?
It says Garmin. Oh,
That's
the time.
not what I was expecting.
It says a time. Well, it actually doesn't say that. I don't want to lie to anybody. It does say 11:38
Oh, now you have moral
or so.
All these years they've been going by the wayside,
I
and
know.
now you've just decided
But
morals matter to me.
You know, for us right now, Josh, 11:38 is a time to think. And
is.
wherever you're at right now, you could be in your car, could be in your shower.
It could be 11:38 on a
It could
different
be
day.
PM. It could be in a different. You could be on a different planet. You're in a different planet right now. Actually, you probably couldn't be.
Although that might be a worldview consideration.
Something exciting. The astronauts who just got rescued, right?
Yeah, so my wife told me about that.
Yeah.
Totally oblivious to it, and she was like, "It's been going on for 9 months."
Yes.
I was like, "It didn't come up on the algorithm."
Yeah, and so President Trump and Elon Musk made sure to get out of space, right? Brought him down. And one of the two astronauts is an elder at a 1689 Baptist church.
No way.
Solid Christian guy. And he gave this little snippet because they did this press conference. And this reporter was, I don't know what her incentive to ask this was, but it was a good question, saying like, hey, I stopped by your church before I came, because he's an elder on their team. And you just talk about how important that was for you. And he's like, you know what? It was absolutely critical for me to be at corporate worship from space every week. And he said, not only that, but I have a buddy who's an elder at a church in, I think he's in Tennessee. And so I would, watch their corporate worship services. But he's like, I missed my church family so much. And at least I could be there from space over the internet. So if you're listening right now and you're in outer space and, kudos to you, that's just kind of like a little pastoral, like, woo, well, why aren't you at church?
or Saturday night doesn't go the way you want it to, because it never does.
Right.
Sunday morning, it's like, oh man, the last 9 Sunday mornings I've gotten in a fight with my spouse.
Sure.
That happens on Sunday mornings.
So Butch Wilmore would tell you could be stranded in space, literally lost in space, and he still makes it a priority in corporate worship. And so we thank you who are listening right now. You've prioritized taking a time to think, which is a podcast that we do that
seeks
addresses
to carefully, thoughtfully engage with issues in the culture and the church, in space culture sometimes, apparently. Just to double down on that Sunday morning thing, little pastoral pro tip. If you're arguing with someone in your house on Sunday morning, first thought, is this the devil? Just ask it. It's like, is this weirdly small inconvenience that's blowing up into a "you always do this" type of conversation?
Is this from the Lord?
Yeah. And sometimes you can go, it's Sunday morning again, ain't it?
Yep.
My kids sleep the worst on Saturday nights.
Yeah.
And my wife and I were just prepared for it. Like, all right,
they're usually out partying, aren't they?
Yeah, with their other toddler friends from church. Party until 7:45 past their bedtime. So we do seek to eventually get to careful, thoughtful engagement with issues in the culture and the church. And on this series, which I haven't yet named, so I can't say this series named, but I think I have a name, maybe.
Yeah. Don't apologize for that name, Josh.
Okay, thanks. Don't apologize. Might be the name. It might not when you see this on your podcast. I still got to deliberate. But on this series about apologetics, really, we're trying to figure out how to, as a church, engage in certain issues so we can engage in the culture. That's really the heart of this podcast. It always has been. And it's now we're specifically focusing on what Chris helpfully defined yesterday as it's a discipline in and of itself, apologetics, a field of study in and of itself, talking about how Christians engage with non-Christians. And on this episode, we're going to talk about fields within that field. So there's
football, baseball.
Soccer is a pitch, so that doesn't really...
Soccer is not a sport. Anyways.
Wow, I hope someone who has played soccer kicks you in the shins, and because you have no shin guards.
Soccer is an athletic game played by individuals who are very, physically fit.
What about cricket?
Cricket? I don't know.
Because I was looking up a professor of mine, Dr. James Anderson.
Yeah.
And I could only find a cricket player named James Anderson. So I was thinking about cricket this morning.
I don't know. I've never been around cricket before. But what I do know is when your players constantly throw themselves on the ground in writhing pain, even though they haven't even been touched, I really question the credibility of the
some
sport.
levels of basketball these days?
That's correct. Thinking about you, LeBron.
Wow. How often is he living rent-free up there?
No, he's not, but he's probably listening.
Okay, we digress. that if you are listening, LeBron, please donate to Downtown Mission Church. Just one small donation of 10% for you would be great. So So this is Josh Holland, pastor of church in Wausau, Wisconsin. Chris Tillman pastors a church in Church
Stevens
Congregation in
Point,
Stevens
Wisconsin.
Point.
Yes.
Together, we combine forces for a time to think, and we want to talk about different methods of apologetics. We can talk about what we think is right or wrong about them, but really just to kind of expand our view. I would imagine most people have one of two visions of apologetics.
Okay.
But we want to give a broad scope of apologetic methods so we can know how to engage with people that we're talking to.
Might say that after this episode, we'll be like method man, right? Like
No,
method man.
I don't think that. No, I don't think so.
You get the flavor for this episode.
Anything else? Anything else?
That's out of my system. All right. So methods,
So
apologetic
methods, I would say, and this is not something coming from someone who studied the field for 30 years. It's just offhand. It seems to me there's about 3 different major methods.
Yeah.
You have a classical method, which tends to emphasize theistic arguments. The basics of the classical method is to say, well, people don't believe in God, so they certainly don't believe in miracles. And if we're going to get them to believe in miracles, i.e. the resurrection, we got to get them to believe in God first because God does miracles. And so it's kind of described as a 2-step method. First, get them to believe that there could be a God.
Right.
Step 2, get them to believe that God is the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so that's where you're going to get your cosmological argument, which we mentioned on the last one, that everything in the universe is contingent, therefore the universe must be contingent, therefore there needs to be some sort of non-contingent being. Yeah. There's other arguments like the argument for morality.
Teleological.
What is the teleological?
There's an end in view, right? There's a design involved with everything here.
Design and purpose. So as we talk about on Genesis, we might hint at the teleological or expressly state it because we're talking about God's good design.
Yeah.
Our bodies have a design. They're not just useful for anything. There's things that make them work well and things that don't make them work well. Things we should do with them and things we don't because they've been designed. But that's a particular worldview, and the teleological starts by saying, and I think even Richard Dawkins admits that it seems like the universe has a design.
What a cheap out.
Right?
It seems like it. Right?
So there are atheists that hold to an apparent design, but that messes with their
so they're not gonna
worldview, so
go
they
to-
don't say it's actually designed. But that's one argument. Don't you just intuitively look around and see that the universe seems designed? Or the modern fine-tuning argument is a more scientific argument for the design. Like, if any of these things was just a little bit off, one way or the other.
Irreducible complexity. Yep.
Right. And so there are scientific and intuitive ways, but the basics of the classical method is to say there has to be a God, or they probably actually say it's most probable, because usually classical guys are thinking in terms of probability, which is one way to distinguish a classical and a presuppositionalist.
It's essentially a philosophical argumentation.
Yeah. Appealing to reason and logic, and that works for a certain type of person, right? You get your William Lane Craigs of the world that have very, very. I think he's even made his own flavor of the cosmological argument, the Kalam. I haven't studied it too deeply, but so that's classical. Then you have evidential, which I would imagine most people are most familiar with evidential apologetics because you've read Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, or you've read Evidence That Demands a Verdict, or you've heard some sort of. I was even just talking to a brother this morning about. Some J. Warner Wallace, maybe he said, who is a former lawyer, kind of in the law sphere, and so he breaks down the case legally, and that is a good representation of what evidentialist arguments are like. It's like being in a courtroom, and you're saying, "Here's the evidence, and the evidence makes most sense with this verdict." Okay. That's most of your resurrection defenses are evidentialist by nature. I would even say a lot of what we did with the This Old Book series had some evidentialist flavor to it, right? It's most reasonable to believe these letters written at this time, not these letters written later, or not by eyewitnesses. So
here's the evidence why.
Some evidences. And then there is, broadly speaking, worldview apologetics. And under worldview apologetics, you have Chris's favorite, presuppositionalism, but you also have something called the cumulative case, which basically argues that when you're defending a worldview, you want to put all these different pieces together and say what makes the best sense together. And so unlike evidentialism, which is usually focusing on one piece of the puzzle, trying to demand a verdict on that, and then evidentialists can say, hey, if I proved to you the resurrection happened, then you have to believe in God because only God can raise from the dead. Classical guys say, if I can prove to you that a God exists, then I can prove to you that that God is God of the Bible. Worldview guys tend to think more broadly and think in terms of critiquing systems of thought.
Yep.
Okay, if you believe this one thing, it actually contradicts this other thing.
Right.
And that means your system is incoherent.
Yep.
And we don't like systems that are incoherent. Warning signs go up, errors flare.
Yeah, blue screen of death.
And so you have within the worldview apologetics cumulative case, which is take all these pieces, what's the most probable answer that depends on that.
Yeah.
And then you have presuppositionalism, which you've been waiting so patiently. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Not really.
I presupposed that you would engage in this conversation. So
I'm just kidding. So presuppositionalism. I graduated from RTS when John Frame was still teaching there. I had him for a couple of classes, and John Frame is like Daddy Warbucks of the presuppositional apologetics world. And his professor, his teacher, Cornelius Van Til, is like Moses of the presuppositional world. He's
Sure.
like the grandpa of it all.
you're kind of cross-pollinating here. You
I
went
am.
Moses
I'm
to Daddy
mixing
Warbucks.
metaphors
Yeah.
effectively, and that's fine at this point. But yeah, I mean, so basically, what presuppositionalism is, and I find it hugely helpful in part because it helps me to be less of a jerk. Okay. And so, if you
We
struggle
talked
with
last.
being a jerk,
Yeah, we talked about the ways not to do apologetics on the last one. Not to do it for your own glory,
exactly,
or to be right, or to punish.
Yeah. So here's why presuppositionalism is. Well, here's what it is, and here's why it makes you not as much of a jerk. So presuppositionalism is a school of thought within apologetics that says everybody makes assumptions about life. Everybody makes assumptions about the way things are, how they ought to be, and we call those presuppositions. So for people, they would function in a world saying, "Hey, it's not right to steal your neighbor's stuff," right? So we're functioning with some presuppositions like there are objective moral truths, right?
Yeah.
You should never rip off your neighbor's stuff, given certain circumstances, right? And so what presuppositionalism does is it says, all right, we all take certain things for granted in how we live, what we believe. Let's take a look at the presuppositions that you hold, and I'll take a look at the presuppositions I hold, and we'll do this together. And then what we'll do is we're going to compare notes and basically come to a conclusion about the, coherency and the consistency of these worldviews. And in the case of presuppositionalism, what it does is it fundamentally believes that the Bible is the presupposition the Christian operates from. Now, why this is important, and I don't want to ride this hobby horse all the way into town before we get to talking about things specifically, but for the Christian, we believe the Bible is the Word of God. And sometimes what can happen in apologetics is we can kind of say like, well, imagine that it's not, or imagine that the more important thing here is that I prove to you, and what you walk away from this conversation with is that you believe that there is a God. Now that's great, that's all well and good, but what we believe about God ultimately needs to be derived from Scripture. So there are, Muslims believe in God, Mormons believe in God. Hindus believe in multiplicity of gods, right? So all kinds of different religions believe in a God. So we really haven't done our job right if we've simply convinced somebody there is a God, right? And so what we want to do in presuppositionalism is say, if we believe the Bible to be the Word of God and that it is consistent and coherent throughout, then what we can do is we don't need to be afraid to stack up our presupposition that the Bible is consistent and what it is, what it claims to be, with anybody who says, well, here's what I believe about things. So we start peeling layers back and ultimately show people that any other worldview is actually inconsistent with the way they live. And that's where we go with presuppositionalism, and then that leads into conversations about the gospel itself. So,
Yeah, so to sum up and add to that, typically speaking, classical guys, the two-step prove God exists and then prove Jesus is that God.
Yep.
Or the evidential guys, one step, prove the resurrection, and that itself proves that God exists.
right.
Typically speaking, both of those methods emphasize some common ground of neutrality.
Sure.
So the evidential guys emphasize that we basically all have the same historical method.
Right.
So if I can prove historical evidences, then we all both believe we're in non-scientific and layman. We all use the same kind of historical method. So we'll use that common shared neutral ground and we'll prove. The classical guys tend to operate like, and I say tend to because in studying a lot of these methods, all these believers say something about the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit's need to cause faith, the Holy Spirit's need to, it's called engendering belief, to make born in you belief. But where the guys like John Frame disagree is they think it's inconsistent to say that and then try to operate neutrally in the argumentation. And so typically speaking, classical guys with theistic arguments say, hey, we all have functioning rational capacities, so let's use reason and logic. And so classical guys, reason and logic, evidential guys, typically historical evidences. And then I would say that you helpfully showed where the cumulative case and the presuppositionalist disagrees, because cumulative case still operates with some sort of, I don't know if I'd call it neutrality, but it doesn't emphasize what presuppositionalism does, which is, oh man, it's getting nerdy, the noetic effects of the fall.
Exactly.
Okay, so the noetic effects of the fall is the ways our minds are corrupted by sin. All right? We talked earlier, when you get angry, do you think clearly?
In that moment, I think I do, but I really don't.
Okay, so sin affects my brain.
Yeah.
And so fundamentally, God has created us as one unified being. We are not separated into parts. That's why we don't have head knowledge and heart knowledge. We just have knowledge.
Right.
And that knowledge can be thinking patterned after God. It can change our affections, but like I really don't love the head knowledge, heart knowledge distinction, because I think the Bible tends to talk about things like Paul says, may your knowledge grow in all love and discernment. It's like knowledge and love, we don't separate these things.
Right.
And just like that, we don't separate our hearts from our souls from our minds. We are a unified being, which means when sin affects us, it affects how we think.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the biggest distinguishing factor for the presuppositionalists, at least in the John Frame, Cornelius Van Til camp, is they're always going to want to emphasize our brains are broken by sin, which means we can't just say, let's find neutral ground and argue based on that.
Yeah. So let's, just to quickly, kind of dip into this, and I don't want to upset kind of our plan for this episode, but I think it's important to draw this distinction now. An example of this for people to kind of think through this is to say, let's take a look at the resurrection, okay? And here's why kind of the evidentialist approach can be problematic. And this is why for a lot of us, we might feel frustrations when we talk with somebody, and we're like, well, here's the evidence. It's because people can look at the evidence and excuse it away, right? Sure. This is what Romans chapter 1 says. Romans chapter 1 says that, even though they knew God, meaning they knew that God is, they refused to acknowledge him as God, right? So that there's this deeply born into us as human beings morality attached to our thinking.
Yeah.
That how we think is informed by our spiritual condition. And so we can look at something like the resurrection and say, oh, I can explain that away. The disciples moved the body. And now the evidentialists will come back and say, yeah, but they were martyred, which is true, right? They were martyred. They were willing to go to their grave for that. But you can keep coming back and saying, yeah, but. Now, these evidences are wonderful to employ in the process of helping somebody understand reasonability of belief. But at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't see that like we're not, as Christian people, we're not on the defensive. We're not in a position where we're constantly having to like, okay, well, I'll help you with the yeah, but, and the yeah, but, and the yeah, but. Say like, friend, can you help me understand why belief in X, Y, or Z is justifiable? Like I can give you all the reasons in the world why the resurrection makes sense and why it happened and why it's true, all this kind of thing. But can you help me make sense of the fact that you believe that beauty exists in a world without God? Mm-hmm. Help me understand that. Help me understand why love is not just preservation of a species to you. And so like you start asking these questions and people are put in a position to defend much bigger questions than they're willing to ask about the evidences that we present that they just excuse away.
Yeah. And that's where I think, one thing to think is on a time to think.
I think so.
Is there is a difference in how people thought 50 years ago versus how they thought today. So there's this distinction between modernism and postmodernism. Modernism is basically there is objective truth. We just find it with our own minds rather than revelation from God. So pre-enlightenment is to find objective truth. It's revealed to you from the divine.
Right.
Post-enlightenment, up until recent day, there's still objective truth. It's just you're a blank slate and you have to find it.
You have to feel it out, touch it, taste it, smell it. Right.
Yeah. So it's either rationalism or empiricism tend to be the two options. Empiricism, whatever I sense, I can then use to figure out what is true.
Which is evidentialist apologetics.
Yeah, roughly. And then you have rationalism, which is whatever I can reason.
Which is
true.
classical apologetics.
Roughly, exactly. And so that's modernism. Is there still is truth? We just got to find it ourselves, not revelation. I think if you have that understanding and you know someone is thinking in that way, then things like evidentialism or classical apologetics are really helpful.
Sure.
Because someone is going to be persuaded by something that seems objective and viable. A lot of the times that we have these books like Lee Strobel or this Wikipedia guy even, who I think is 50-ish.
Sure.
I think he was more modern than postmodern.
Correct.
Because he was born in the 60s or the 70s. Like he was born before subjectivity was really popular.
Exactly.
However, in modern day, we discuss this.
You mean in the postmodern day?
Oh my goodness. In postmodern day, we discuss this ad nauseum about heresy of orthodoxy. It was like, why would people believe something that has such little evidence?
Right.
Well, because truth is relative, and I don't have to have logically coherent. So it's just a different way of thinking. I think that's something to keep in mind when we think about the frustration of presenting the evidences of the resurrection and someone not caring, or disagreeing with it, or presenting a case for there being a God, for theism, and someone going, but it's like people might just legitimately be thinking in a truth is relative way, and we have to find another way to get at them. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the worldview apologetics comes, because you can present to them their own system. And this is kind of what Frame says, is when you're doing the worldview apologetics of presuppositionalism, you want to first, as you said earlier, start with going, okay, what does Chris believe? Mm-hmm. And if you're charitable, you might even want to help Chris know that he believes something.
Right.
Chris might not know he has a worldview.
Exactly.
He just lives.
Yep.
He just wakes up. Chris goes to work. He's got a family. He loves his family. He doesn't know why he loves his family.
Right.
Like, he just loves them. He hasn't thought about the epistemological foundations of his love. But you want to say, hey, Chris, you actually have a belief about anthropology. You have a belief about creation. You have a belief about knowledge and ethics. And is that in accord with your belief about origins, right? So you hinted at this earlier. Can naturalism, the belief that everything is just material, account for love?
Right.
Why would it? And so you start to ask those questions. You're helping Chris start to have a little bit of doubt in his own foundation.
Right.
And then one of the moves, if you're charitable, and I keep saying if you're charitable because, once again, we're trying to emphasize that you don't employ any of this to win.
Right.
But one of the moves I think has been helpful is to say, okay, I've helped Chris see maybe there's some inconsistencies in his worldview. And then I say, hey, you want to try mine on for size? Mm-hmm. James Anderson calls worldviews glasses. They're lenses through which you view the world. And you're kind of saying, hey, would you try my glasses on? Just see if they fit. See if you see better.
Yep.
And there's a way in which, with the worldview apologetics, you can both cause a little bit of doubt in Chris's presuppositions, his foundations that he thought he had, maybe even by helping him see he has them.
Right.
And then you can say, try this on for size. Does it make more sense that a world that involves love and beauty is created by someone who is loving and beautiful, or is happenstance and only materialistic?
Yep.
And so you're starting to help someone see that not only is there a problem with their worldview, but yours actually fixes that problem. Because as Anderson has said, it's not enough that someone else is wrong. You could be wrong too.
Correct. Right. Exactly.
Like, if you're both wrong, then everyone's wrong.
Yep.
But if you can present a more coherent, right? And that's one of the things we believe is that the Bible presents a coherent worldview because God has revealed the worldview. Anything that I just said that sparks anything for you?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, maybe let's proceed in addressing methods generally, and then, unless, you want to talk more specifically at this point. But
I want to emphasize that while I think it's helpful to emphasize that our brains are broken by sin and they need to be renewed.
Yep.
So when you're doing apologetics, we can't assume neutral ground.
Correct.
I think that's helpful. I also don't want to go so far as to speak about evidentialism or classical apologetics as a way that they're unhelpful. I think they're great starting points. I think if you use them, and they're great for different people. Some people have logical reasons that they have reasons that are based on reason or logic in their mind why they don't believe.
Yep.
Some people have moral objections. That's what was interesting back in the day. Former pastor of the church did a public debate with a guy, and I think the debate was supposed to be about, can we trust the God of the Bible, as in like his word? But it became very clearly about how much the guy hated the God of the Bible.
Right.
It's like, well, this isn't about trustworthiness at all. This is a moral objection. You hate him. So there are moral objections people have, moral conundrums like the problem of evil.
Yep.
And I think to have a lot of these in your back pocket can be really helpful. You start to address some of these small questions, all the while realizing that if you don't address the big question of worldview, which is one of the things a presuppositionalist approach will say is you have to address the fact that humans in modern day, postmodern day, if you will, both modernist and postmodern, believe it is their own mind that will achieve truth.
Sure.
Whether it's through picking and choosing of relativity, or whether it's through reason and logic of the modern day, both of those schools are thinking humans can decide for themselves what is good and right and true. And that's the exact opposite of divine revelation.
Right, exactly.
And so if you don't address that, then you're presenting evidential arguments or classical arguments to someone who is still operating as an autonomous
kind
moral
of spitting
agent.
in the wind, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what it is. And I think, so presuppositionalism isn't just a Van Tillian construct from, the early 1900s or anything. I mean, Calvin himself, Calvin was somebody who basically functioned this way. Now, Calvin was in a Christianized environment, right? So I mean, it's literally, the state was involved with the church in significant ways. And so the assumptions about what people believe were baked into how you did apologetics, right? In the 16th century, that's how it worked. But I think what's important is to see that evidentialism and classical apologetics, they just don't go quite far enough to account for a world in which people are born dead in their sins and trespasses. So we can use these things, right, in our approach toward an individual, but really and it's funny because I feel like presuppositional apologetics is the most charitable brand of apologetics
Interesting.
that I've encountered, because I think sometimes when you are trying to win with somebody and using why don't you see this? Why don't you see this? Why don't you see this? It lends itself to frustrated Christians who engage with people more out of an effort at some point to try to convince them, because the evidence is so overwhelmingly in favor of what's trying to be proved that we just get so upset and say oh, why don't you see this? Why don't you see this? Why don't you see this? And presuppositional apologetics is most charitable because it says I know why you don't see this. I know why you don't see this, because you're dead in your sins and trespasses. But it's also the most offensive, and I don't mean offensive, but offensive, in as much as it basically says, without telling somebody in as few words, I'm going to show you why you're wrong, right? And that's helpful, because you can leave conversation with somebody saying, here's the case for the resurrection. Okay, cool. That's wonderful. And they'll continue to operate with their entire frame of reference with just new information, right?
Sure.
And so there's new information there. And so, yes, you might have the individual who's okay, yes, this is the missing piece I needed, okay? But there's other stuff that's functioning in the background there. What we want to assume is that anybody we're talking with, we don't want to assume that they have any level of, what we call functional belief or functional religious, conviction. What we want to do is assume people we're talking to couldn't care less, right? And if we can assume that helps us, because as we engage the individual, then what we're doing is we're just saying, hey, friend, look, I know you love your family, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about why you love your family.
Yeah.
And if you give people the opportunity to like just ask them questions and don't, and I think here's why it can be unhelpful to just kind of put all our eggs in the basket of classical apologetics or evidentialism. It's like we're always seeming to function on the defensive in that environment. We're always saying like, all right, now I've got to have an answer. I've got to have an answer. I've got to have an answer. It's like, well, but are the people you're speaking with, do they have answers?
Sure.
You know, do these people you're talking to that you just feel so frustrated, like, oh, you know what? They're not believing what's really obvious and right in front of them. Romans chapter 1 says, yeah, they don't. And here's why. And the reason is because they do not see fit to acknowledge God because they want to steal his glory, you know, and we don't want to think that way about our neighbors. But at the end of the day, that's what sin is in our hearts, is stealing glory from God. So let's help them see there's a fundamental problem here. It's not just that you don't believe enough stuff. It's that there's something wrong that needs to change. So.
Well, another tool in this arsenal is the idea of common ground. So one of the big differences between some of the rational classical method or the empiricist evidential method is that they assume a little bit that there's some sort of neutral. It's like capture the flag.
Right.
There's a place where we can meet to discuss where my worldview and your worldview don't intersect, and we'll discuss in the neutral, and then I'll try to pull you onto my side. Whereas what the presuppositionalist says is there's actually zero neutral ground.
Right.
And you're like, but I believe a lot of the same stuff as non-believers, right? Like they do believe that you shouldn't steal, or they do love their kids. Well, what the presuppositionalist says is that's not neutral ground, it's common ground, but it's our ground.
Yes.
And here's why that's helpful is from a Christian worldview, whatever is true because it's God's.
Yes.
It's revealed by God. And so someone who believes that God doesn't exist but still loves their kids is borrowing capital from Christianity.
Yes, that's an important term.
You want to help them see they're actually borrowing that.
Yeah.
They're not borrowing that from methodological naturalism. It makes no sense to have a deep, heartfelt affection for your child if evolution is the means of procreation. That's all survival of the fittest. And like I one of the things that I always think about in terms of the argument for evolution is like evolution says something like species finds mates for procreation, right? And it's like, man, when I was in middle school and didn't have a girlfriend, I wasn't thinking, oh no, I have fewer prospects than other people for procreation. I was thinking, no one likes me.
Right.
It's
exactly.
like, and evolution doesn't account for that, right? There's something in our hearts with the emotions we feel, with the beauty we experience, with the love that we have that makes no sense in the dominant framework that people have today in America, which is scientific-based materialism, naturalism.
And the naturalism, I mean, just by way of just kind of dissecting this just in the moment here, is to say the naturalist would say, yeah, but that's a mask. You know, like your desire to be liked is simply, you know, you get like the roots of this in Freudian psychology and everything. It's like, really this comes down to procreation, and you're fooling yourself into believing that this is about loneliness. That is actually, you're coming to a point of sexual maturity, so you want to find somebody to procreate with. It's like, okay, all right, so that's that. Do you really believe? And so this is where the presuppositional approach really comes in. Do you really believe that's true?
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're kind of banking on is that there are certain people like a Freud, or there are certain, there's certain people in academia, like antinatalists, that do seem to legitimately believe some crazy stuff. Right. And they honestly, without super miraculous intervention, might be too far gone. But most people don't actually believe the logical implications of those things.
Right, exactly.
Right? And so you're kind of banking on that common ground. It's not neutral, but it is shared ground. Back to that atheist debate, I remember the guy talking about his grandkids, and I just wanted to be like, why does that matter to you at all if you believe that there's no purpose or design in this life?
What about disability? You know, what about those types of things? And so there is, in the presuppositional approach, ultimately there is an appeal to the subjective. There really is, because we are not only objective beings. And we fool ourselves if we think like objectivity, like we function as input-output machines. It's just not what happens. We do pass judgment, we do make assessments, we do have values that we live by that are entirely independent of, you know, what we would call reason or evidence. You know, like when you're 5 years old and you know, like you just know that it's not good to take something that's not yours, right? And you steal the cookie from your mom or dad's, little stash they have and whatever. It's like,
this is hypothetical, right? You would never have done this?
I'm sure I have. Nutty bars in high school was the thing for me. But it's not just because mom and dad said no. Because you go across every culture, you don't find feral people running all over the place because they had bad parents. People just know it. And that's subjective, this sense of we know it. And so somebody has to have gone so far off the grid and hardening their heart to say something like, we should no longer have children because the planet can't sustain humanity and humanity should become extinct. Right? That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. But the craziness of that is not necessarily provable. You can't just say, you could prove that humanity poses an undue burden on the earth, right? You could prove that using certain data. But we know it's crazy. We know that's awful. And so we do appeal on one level to subjective impression because we are built into us as human beings. It's just the sense of this doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah. To put some legs on this, we are going to be, I would say, primarily addressing future questions through a worldview lens, through a presuppositional lens, which when a classical argument or evidential argument is helpful, it'll come
absolutely.
in. I think they're really helpful in service of the larger project. But maybe two examples just to put some legs on this. Number one, the hallmark Van Tillian presuppositional argument is called the TAG, the transcendental argument. And it goes something like this. When you're arguing or debating with someone about belief, the very fact that you can have the conversation proves the existence of God.
Yes.
Okay, this is a little bit meta, but the idea is the fact that you're assuming you can communicate, that communication matters, that you both have logical faculties, that they work properly.
Right.
And so all of that presupposes belief in God. Well, why? Because if you take the opposite of it and you say, we've come here by happenstance through random mutation, and we have somehow ended up with the logical faculties of rationalization that no other creatures have. That makes less sense than God created us with in his image with logical faculties. And so Van Til was known for that really simple, and that's why a lot of people don't like him, is because he just hung his hat on that one thing often and said, the very thing that we're even arguing about presupposes God. But that's kind of what's going to happen when we talk about the moral argument, right? If someone says God cannot exist because there's so much evil in the world, one of the responses is, well, how do we know that there is good and evil at all? If you're objectively saying there's some things that are good and some things that are evil, then that presupposes that someone has deemed things good and evil. And if it's anything more than your personal preference, if it's anything more than what Chris thinks is good, but Josh could say it's evil, or Josh thinks it's evil, but Chris could say it's good. If it's anything more than personal preference, there has to be some sort of ultimate authority. And so we're going to appeal to those types of arguments. And even Job. I think Job is an example you mentioned last podcast, I believe, or earlier this one sometime. And what's interesting about Job is it can be lost in the shuffle a little bit, but basically what happens is Job is a righteous sufferer. And he's got 3 friends. And you know what? At first, they're great friends. I mean, they sit with him. He's suffering. They mourn with him. But eventually, they're like, hey, man, you're probably suffering for a reason.
Right.
And what you see in Job is this human inability to answer, how could a righteous person suffer?
Yeah.
Well, Job is saying, I'm righteous, therefore I shouldn't suffer. The friends are saying, well, you're suffering, so
righteous.
you must have done something. And that's where Job starts defending
Kenneth
himself.
Copeland, if you will.
Yeah. And so what you find, both of those are human arguments.
Yeah.
They're centered on man-centered rationality. None of the friends, none of Job can figure out how a righteous person could suffer.
Yep.
So then God comes and answers him, not with an argument, but with his presence.
Right.
And effectively, what he says is, you're a human and I'm God.
Yeah.
And that's where presuppositionalism is helpful,
Yep.
is we can present arguments for the resurrection. They're really helpful. I was super helped by Lee Strobel's Case for Christ, Tim Keller's Reason for God.
Sure.
One of those is more classical. One of those is more evidential. I mean, those were some of the first books I read when I was coming back to Christ.
Sure.
They're super helpful. They build confidence. They give you reasons. And ultimately, we need to address the elephant in the room that is, I'm trusting in my own mind and my own faculties to reason or to find evidence.
Yep.
And that's what God does for Job. That's what kind of the presuppositionalist framework does,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we're going to be operating from that. If that seems unclear or new and you have more questions,
Drop us a line.
drop us a line, or, some of you guys know where we live. You can knock on our door between the hours. I'm not going to tell you what hours because,
6 a.m. and 6 a.m.
wow, you are available.
I'm available.
Or talk to us at church. We love having these conversations. We love to be helpful. So hopefully this was helpful. And if we accidentally hit good in the process, then by golly, that's fun. Thanks for taking the time to think.